Hello and welcome to the Functional Forum. Really glad to have you here because this is a very special moment. I share much appreciation to you anywhere in the world where you are watching this from. So before we get started tonight, we have a very special guest and we have some great content for you lined up. But I wanted to take a moment just to look back over the last 10 years of the Functional Forum, the evolution of medicine, and talk about contextualizing what we've done here. Now, the theme has always been to reduce the friction for this new health system to emerge that is focused on creating true health. And ultimately, that all started with the Functional Forum in the beginning of 2014, because back then, the biggest point of friction is that almost no doctors knew about functional medicine. It seems hard to believe it today, but back then there was no free content online for doctors, and it wasn't cool and sexy and aspirational to be a functional medicine doctor. So that was our first port of call at the evolution of medicine. The second thing in 2015 was to reduce the friction to other doctors to get on board. And so while the Functional Forum started as a meetup in New York, other meetups started popping up all around America and all around the world. And we supported all of those meetups with the support of organizations like the Institute for Functional Medicine. And then in 2016, we really wanted to focus on getting everyone who had been trained in practice to actually deliver this to their community. And that's when we came up with the Functional Medicine Micro-Practice, the book, The Evolution of Medicine, and many other things around that time to make it easy for practitioners to start their own practice and have an impact in their community. Alongside that were some of our partners. Fullscript has been a partner for a long time because it was really helping with the infrastructure of having to deal with all the supplements. We supported organizations like Serbo because they created an electronic health record that made it easy for doctors to practice functional medicine. And then we partnered with an organization like Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center because they had the patient education necessary to help practitioners build strong, sustainable practices. Then in 2018, we undertook an experiment to see what would it look like if you put this kind of medicine at the front of healthcare and you started with health coaches first. And that led to the initial iteration on New Health, and then what New Health is today, an alternative to health insurance where health-focused care is the default and at the very front of the line rather than the last resort when none of allopathic medicine works for you and your chronic illness. And then in 2019, I wrote the book, The Community Cure, because I saw one glaring issue, is that the current way that functional medicine was practiced was not nearly efficient enough for it to become the standard of care. So that was the Community Cure, looking at groups, the cross-section of functional integrated medicine, lifestyle medicine, and community, and looking particularly at the way that group medical visits could solve some of that equation. And then that turned into Heal Community, where we looked to see if we could deliver that on insurance in partnerships with health systems. Over the last few years, I've been very interested in tracking outcomes across a whole network, and I've had an opportunity to work with the team at Viability to learn about that and how we can work together to prove that functional medicine works and create a network effect of practices. And then earlier this year, had an opportunity to actually consult major healthcare systems to learn more about where the friction exists for the implementation of this kind of care into health systems and organizations. But tonight, after all of that, I want to talk about what I still think is the elephant in the room and what is next on the agenda and what we're going to be focusing on here at Evolution of Medicine in 2025, this year of transformation. And that is that pure and simple functional medicine in its current form is too slow and too hard to become the standard of care. If I hear one thing from practitioners over and over again, is that this is hard medicine. It is not easy to hold all of the data in your mind and try and come up with a clear plan for any new patient. And so ultimately we want to do something about that. And this is not something that I can do because I'm not a clinician, and although I understand functional medicine reasonably well. And so I'm excited to reintroduce, because she's been on the Functional Forum a number of times, my new co-conspirator in this effort, Dr. Kristine Burke. So Dr. Kristine Burke has been a pioneer in the field of functional medicine for almost 2 decades. Back in 2015, when I was preparing to do my first TEDx talk, I actually came to visit Dr. Burke's meetup that actually preceded the Functional Forum. She'd had a community meetup here in the El Dorado County area of California for a number of years, and had brought practitioners together to make it easy for them to gain confidence and practice. Over the last few years, you've seen her a number of times on the 2018 New Vision Tour. Also in 2020, in February, we worked together to put on an event at Davis Medical School that was really awesome. And then in 2022, we did a functional forum about gout, where I was involved personally. And then earlier this year, our most popular forum of this year, both in number of views, but also the interest from practitioners on the email list, has been on reversing cognitive decline. And there's some incredible things about Dr. Burke's practice. One is that no patient in her practice has ever had a heart attack. And that the second is that she is one of the top practitioners in cognitive decline. It's not regular in functional medicine that you compare the outcomes of practitioners in the network, but particularly in cognitive decline, Dr. Bredesen set out, when he set out his training, that all the practitioners following his methodology had to track their outcomes. And because of her stellar outcomes, Dr. Burke was chosen to be one of the 6 principal investigators in the Dementia Reversal Trial. And amongst all those other things, Dr. Burke is also my doctor, and if you were watching earlier on in the year, played a critical role in diagnosing the cause of my father's cognitive decline. And so Dr. Burke and I have been talking and connecting for a number of years. And so I think it's only fitting that we bring her in to talk a little bit more about what we have up our sleeves. So enjoy. So today we are joined by Dr. Kristine Burke, who, amongst many other things, is a leading clinician in the field of cognitive decline. And the topic today is reversing cognitive decline at scale. And part of how this came up, and Kristine will humor me for this, but over time, you've tolerated a lot of my wacky ideas about things that we could do together. And I think anytime the concept of cognitive decline came up, there was always a lot of interest of doing something interesting, like buying a hotel or whatever it might be. But it always came down to the same choke point, which is that this is hard, it takes a lot of time, and there's really no capacity it's very difficult to build capacity to do this for a lot of people. Can you just talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, we've talked about a lot of different iterations for how we could try to get this to more people. And what I have realized in my own practice and in training other practitioners in this work is that it is a pretty heavy lift. It takes a lot of people to support the patient in their journey, to support the family, and then for the practitioners to be able to manage the volume of data and to do it well.
Awesome. So just before we get into what we're going to talk about today, I know for both of us, this is an area where there's personal interest and passion. Do you want to just talk about that? Because you could have just coasted along being a family medicine doctor or even a functional medicine vascular specialist and never touched this area and probably been fine.
Well, so I had 3 family members that have been affected by this disease. My great aunt, who was really more like a grandmother to me, and my great uncle, her husband, and then my aunt, my uncle's wife, just recently passed from this disease. And that one was really the hardest one because at that point I had knowledge that I could use to help her, and my family that didn't live near and really wasn't aware of the type of work that I was doing just wasn't really interested in pursuing it or finding out because it wasn't what they were being told was possible.
Yeah, that is really tricky. And, for myself now, my father living on the other side of the world, when we connected last year and you shared with me, if you see rapid cognitive decline, think infection, and I went over there, he had a great medical team, and yet I was almost like I was talking a different language to all of them. The idea that I could have known ahead of time that there would be some sort of mold issue was very obvious to you, but was very foreign to any of that medical organization. That was part of the beginning of this conversation of let's try and find something that any doctor could use to really replicate, if not your work completely, then something akin to it. So I want to just start by saying setting the foundation for where I believe that we've come from and where we're going. And in part of this presentation, my thinking is that there's been sort of 3 stages of functional medicine. And I'd love to get your input on how you feel about it too. So my feeling is that like from the beginning, let's say, the early pioneers in the 80s until about 2014, I'm calling functional medicine 1.0. And functional medicine 1.0, these are pioneers. Imagine people, coming across the West. We both live in El Dorado County, California, right? So people coming across in the gold rush, and they have an idea of where they're going. They're excited about the potential in the future, but they don't really have a good map. They don't really know where they're going, and they have very limited ability to get around. And when I think about the early days of functional medicine, I've heard Bob Roundtree talking about his big, before the supplement industry, he's just got big vats of herbs and he's dishing them out. It seems like about right?
Yeah, that does seem like about right.
How do you look back on those pioneering days? How do you look back on those now?
Sometimes a little bit wistfully, because it was a little simpler time, and we were focused on laying the groundwork, laying the foundation with the lifestyle change, really focusing on gut health and how that impacted inflammation. And it was a much simpler view of what it was that we could actually accomplish. And as that's evolved, the complexity has evolved. And so now it just takes more to do some of the more complicated work, like reversing cognitive decline.
Awesome. All right, so that's stage one. Now let's get into stage two, and this is what I'm calling functional medicine 2.0. And actually, this is not the first time that I called it this. So in October 2016, we actually did a functional forum called Functional Medicine 2.0 in Chicago with, who was that? Dr. Jeff Glad. So Dr. Glad is now Chief Medical Officer of Fullscript. He was one of the people that sort of outlined the early days, the potential of this micro practice. And so I felt like in Functional Medicine 2.0, Dr. Terry Walls was there. So now there's like real energy and evidence in all these particular niches, right? So that's one thing. But secondly, there was the emergence of these sort of tools, right? So you had the electronic health record, you had Fullscript, you had booking software, you had, the software started to like meld different things together. And then also you had, the sort of IFM blew up, like lots of practitioners wanted to go through more training, all these other education organizations starting to really get momentum. You see a lot of graphs going like this as far as like number of practitioners engaged, number of people visiting the website. You've got the growth of podcasts and summits and all those kind of things. So the analogy that I kind of put to that is now, people are living in an area and they've got a car. Right, so you're not a pioneer on a horse and buggy anymore. You've got a car and you can drive around, and you're getting familiarity with the territory. That's what I feel like. You've got a good map, right? You've got a good car and you're driving around. Does that seem reasonable to you? I mean, I think that is the story of your practice right now, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think you begin to get comfortable, you know where to find everything, you know how to get what you need, you understand what your patients need, and it becomes a much more comfortable thing to do.
Awesome. And I would also say, like, the other thing I want to say is there has been a lot of like niche mentorship, right? So now you've got clinicians. Terry Walls is a good example. Dr. Datis Karazian, like there are these doctors that have built real skills in particular areas. Doctors have niched themselves into those areas and are looking for that sort of support. And so you actually have like, great education resources, great mentorship resources, and so forth. But it's like that's where we sit today. And I guess my contention is for today is that we are moving into the era right now with this session here, which is that I believe that we are entering functional medicine 3.0. And functional medicine 3.0 to me is that so much of actually, one of the initiating things for the Functional Forum right at the beginning was I was sitting, it was 2009, it was the first time I went to the Integrated Health Symposium. And I'm sitting there and I'm watching Jeff Bland give his talk. Never seen Jeff Bland speak before. And I'm looking around the room and I'm like, wow, he's really got the attention of all these medical doctors. Like they're like thinking about his every word. And then I looked in the back and I was like, why isn't anyone videoing this? You know what I mean? Like that no one was capturing that content. And so we were relying in that moment on people taking in the lecture, writing it down, remembering it, translating it into current practice on Monday morning. And all of that just seemed extremely unlikely. And, even today, even in Functional Medicine 2.0, when you've got a map and you've got these other supporters, I just feel like it's still quite unlikely, right? In that it's quite hard to do. And what I believe that functional medicine 3.0 is about providing, in the analogy that we're talking about, a GPS. And we've all been drivers now in a world where the GPS didn't exist, right? Where we had to use the map, and maybe we were good at the map and maybe we weren't good at the map. But then now the GPS comes along and it does two things. One, it allows you, it's guiding you step by step on what to do in real time, right? So in real time, you don't have to look at the map because it's guiding you. Yes, you may decide that you know this area well enough, but you will probably keep the GPS on over time. I don't know how you are as a driver, you keep the GPS on. One, because you don't know the dynamics of this particular day, right? And could might there be traffic in a certain way and you have to take another step? But also, if you're driving anywhere that you haven't been before, you definitely need the GPS because you actually have no where you're going. And most people have actually lost a lot of their map skills. And so I just feel like that's a good analogy to explain, is that so much of what is needed is support in the moment for the person that's sitting in front of you. And I would love to just get your feeling on this. My feeling is that once people understand what 3.0 is, you'll look back and go, how do we ever expect to sit in these conferences, even going over patient cases, and apply that knowledge to a completely individual person?
Yeah, no, even as you're describing that, like the functional medicine 2.0 reminds me of my days when I was living in LA, and I would have the Thomas Guide map in the seat next to me, and you'd have to, rifle through the sheets, and then the next page was never the next road, like it was like 5, pages later, and it does kind of feel a bit like that, like thinking back on all of the notebooks that I had just filled with notes from all of these conferences, and then leafing through them and writing my own table of contents so I could find what I needed to find again. Like it really is exactly as you described.
Well, that's the analogy that I want to give. And one day I'll tell you about what I think functional medicine 4.0 is, but we won't go there for now because we'll just focus on that. So, what we're doing here at TruNeura and what Kristine and I have been working on here for a while is really like what we think is a GPS, particularly initially for reversing cognitive decline. And I guess I want to talk into, I think the thing that is happening right now in care that is stifling productivity. And I want to talk about data, because it seems to me that data is becoming a giant pain for most functional medicine practitioners. One, all of the data that comes in, right, all of the lab testing. Two, wearables, and that, like, the patient comes in with a wearable, and I think the patients think, oh, my doctor's going to love this. I've got my Oura Ring, I've got my Whoop, I'm going to show them, and they're going to have a lot of great insight. But actually, it's a nightmare for the doctor because it's not structured, not organized. Third is then synthesizing that data into useful stuff. And then, fourth is like bringing it together and keeping the patient engaged, because, at the end of the day, I know you have tons of data, but the patient isn't really like using it in any reasonable way. So maybe you could just talk for a moment about what it's been like to kind of manage that in your practice and what you've had to do to get the kind of outcomes that you've got.
Yeah, well, and I think too, right, as you start off in functional medicine, you have a set of labs and different lab companies that you're using and the data that you're familiar with, but as you grow and expand what you do, you get more and more and more data. And then you're constantly trying to juggle that to remember what you've already ordered for a patient, especially once a few years have gone by that you're working with someone. It's hard to remember, like, have I done this? Have I done that? Did I organize? Have I corrected this imbalance that I found, in a previous lab? And so, for most of us, our electronic health record is really a compendium of PDF files. And so that data doesn't really integrate. You have to remember what you named it so that you could find it again. Like, there's just a lot of uphill friction for tracking all of that stuff. And so I started making spreadsheets so that we could organize the data, we could track it over time, we could see it longitudinally, we could notate what was done for a patient so that you could start to see the treatment story unfold, kind of like we do with the functional medicine timeline, where we're trying to see the health in the context of their life experiences. And so we were doing that with spreadsheets, and then, one spreadsheet begat another spreadsheet, and then now you've got two that are talking to each other, and one informs a PowerPoint that you're giving to the patient so that you can deliver the information. And it just started getting really, really complicated.
Well, I don't know many other practitioners that have almost like a part-time CTO in their office, but you've had that, and I've seen some of those spreadsheets, and they're really cool and they're really sophisticated, but I just could never see that being adopted by most practitioners because it's easier just to do whatever they're doing now, which is you get all the data, you try and work it out, hope you don't miss something, and then just say, okay, well, I think this is the starting point for you. And, different practitioners do it in different ways. Some have chosen to have a certain foundational program that they put everyone through because most people need gut and detox support at the beginning, and that clears up the case a little bit, and then you can, really get the most out of your advanced testing. And I think there's a lot of merit to that kind of thinking, but all of that thinking is really presupposed on the idea that this is hard, and we've got to find an easier way to do it, because I know you've also experienced that that ultimately the reward that you feel for being able to reverse chronic illness is not always the top priority of every doctor.
Yeah. And we've talked about that just being able, especially working with people with cognitive decline, being able to see their mind wake up where you can reconnect with them, that is an amazing shot of power that just fills you with the energy that you need to keep going. And I know I've talked to many of my colleagues, and people talk about the amount of time that they spend preparing for visits before they meet with patients and reviewing all of the labs and organizing it, or the flip side of that, the amount of time that we spend afterwards creating a written plan for the patient so that they know what they're supposed to do, so that they can follow it, and that we can instill that with our health coaches so that they can help the patients be successful implementing it. There's a lot of data management and a lot of data transfer. And so the easier that we can make that so that you could have one place where you can look for what you need and you can see what's happened over time, I think that's really the next iteration that we need. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And we've told practitioners over 10 years to focus on a niche of business, and you could look at all the different niches, but if you take away the sort of complexity of patient care, it seems like cognitive decline would actually be perfect for many functional medicine doctors, because you've got a population that is willing to spend out of pocket for something that they can't get. There's literally no other alternatives. I mean, if you're doing weight loss, GLP-1 is there and your functional medicine clinic is there, and maybe they're integrated with each other, but there are other things that will do the job at whatever cost, right? Whereas in cognitive decline, none of the drugs can arrest and go in the other direction. And some of the outcomes that we can show here from your clinic show that there is a remarkable gap between doing nothing, the standard of care, and the outcomes available in this kind of precision care.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when you're looking at people who already have notable cognitive decline, but we have a huge array of people that we can help with this work, where it's people with what we call subjective cognitive impairment, where the senior moments and the I'm just getting older, and all the things that we ascribe it to when we don't want to face that things are changing, and then just prevention so that we don't end up there. And it's all applicable with the exact same interventions, just the weight of it, how much of it we need to do is different the earlier that we begin.
Yeah. I'd say one of the things that's been fun over the last little while is, as we start to have these meetings with other partners and so forth, it's funny how often those senior moments happen to the other people, and also sometimes to us,
it's true.
On the calls. And it's once you see it, you can't unsee it. There's 40, 50, 60-year-old people who are participating on these calls. And ultimately that, it's been well said over and over by many people that Alzheimer's is starting 30 years before, cognitive decline starting 30 years before. But once you see it, you become very cognizant of it. And I would also say that it just seems to me that with the pandemic and loneliness and all these different areas and the toxins in the environment and so forth, it does seem that having a brain-focused program is going to be mission critical to achieve the goal that we're talking about, which is actually reversing chronic disease at the scale that it exists. And so I'm really excited to be going there. So before we get into sort of how this will affect both patients. I think, one thing I wanted to bring up to you there is that you talked about the care plan, and the care plan is always static, right? And I think one of the things that I'm excited about to unleash in Functional Medicine 3.0 is reimagining the pillars of health. And I know we were talking earlier, and you talked about the fact that the pillars is not a new concept, right? All the way through your education. Do you want to talk about your relationship to pillars?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all learn that the lifestyle, the therapeutic lifestyle changes are the literal foundations of health. And so the concept that we need to be addressing those is certainly nothing new. But we've added on to that we also need to be paying attention to some of these environmental factors and the exposome as part of that basis, as opposed to having it only be in the clinical realm. Like, we really need the patients to be paying attention to this. And then also to the things that they're doing that affect their microbiome in every area of their body, not just their gut microbiome.
Yeah, so let's just jump into this. One of the things that you will see on the screen here now is that we believe that these pillars should be verbs. And I think this is even though it's a subtle tweak, I've never seen verb pillars, but like the thing that the verb really accentuates to me is that this is action, and this is action needed from the patient. So if you look under the lifestyle pillar, we have move, rest and nourish. Right, the three foundational things. Under rest will be sleep, but it would also be sort of stress reduction, movement in the body. I mean, let's, I guess, take a moment on those three. Mission critical to reversing cognitive decline.
Mission critical. Obviously, how we nourish our bodies, how we nourish our brains is going to be integrally important to maintaining brain health. And then moving the body is particularly important in brain health because exercise is one of the best ways that we have to increase BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, to stimulate the growth of new connections in the brain and to maintain the ones that we have. And then adding in our rest, because sleep is the time when the brain offloads its toxins. So we have that lymphatic lymph flow at night while we're sleeping. And so our metabolic waste, any toxins that have been accumulated, byproducts from inflammatory processes, all of that needs to be flushed out while we sleep. So while those are just important pillars of health in general, they each have a particular significance in cognitive health.
Awesome. Let's go again, talk about you mentioned the environmental a minute ago. So in the functional medicine matrix, you've got detoxification lives there as one of the seven, or toxins is one of the seven key pieces there. I know you mentioned a minute ago, but just I want you to just double down here on the fact that now we are creating a way that we can see that the patient can be active and see this as part of their responsibility. Why was this so important to you?
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's why I wanted to shift it into the shared piece that the practitioner and the patient have to have, because there's so much about environmental exposure that's in the control of the person themselves. Yeah. And if they're just looking to be detoxed by me, for me to do something to change their environment, what we found is that it's just not successful. They have to be a partner in that process, and they have to be willing to change those things or to address the mold in their house if that's the thing that seems to be a major contributor.
And I would just say, it's not easy to find a verb for the microbiome, but I love compose because it's not like get rid of things or add things, which I think is quite a simplified way. It's really about the composition of the microbiome, and it might even be the most important part of the whole system. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think we've focused importantly so much on the gut microbiome because it's critical. It affects our immune system. The gut-brain axis is super important in the cognitive health arena where we're talking about. But we have a microbiome at every interface. In fact, just yesterday, Dr. Bredesen and I were talking about an article that I had found, which was a basic science research study where they were looking at components of the brain affected by Alzheimer's disease, and they used next-gen sequencing to understand what the microbes were in the brain tissue, which we have always considered to be sterile, but it's not. Even the controls have this wide variety of different types of microbes that can be found in the tissue. So we have this this balance always between what we need as our beneficial microbes, what are present that maybe we don't need but aren't infecting us, and then the ones that take the opportunity to create infection. And that balance is really where we need to be lending more attention. And that starts with how we compose all of the different interfaces in our nose, in our mouth, in our lungs, in our gut, everywhere.
Awesome. Well, I want to talk about the third sort of category in that psychosocial, and this was like particularly important to me. I mean, one, with Connect, that is a foundation. You see that in the foundations of the IFM matrix, and ultimately, you know, through the book and learning about the power of loneliness, or the power of community and connection, and that seems like a critical piece. And I'm glad that we're going to have that be sort of front and center. But these other two, reflect and grow, you know, having now been a year, with my father, and seeing like, it's one thing to get excited about a protocol and to do it for a bit, but ultimately, if you want to live free of cognitive decline for long periods of time, there's a personal growth element to that.
Yeah, there really is.
And I just felt like, ultimately, I think that the middle of the matrix, right, the center where we have this sort of psycho-emotional type of work, there's a lot in there. And I just feel like with Connect and Grow, to be able to like have a way to remind patients consistently that growth and connection and reflection on where you've gone and where you're going is going to be critical to maintaining it long term. And so I'm excited to see those verbs in there, and something really powerful along the way. One of the things I want to share about the way that we'll be working with these pillars, that these pillars are prioritized by importance, and also that priority will change over time as people integrate with the particular pillars. And that dynamic level of patient care is, I think, what is needed, so that patients know what is the most important thing to me to be focused on now, and have agreement with their coach and practitioner about that journey. And the scoring of these pillars will be made up from intake data, wearable data, and later on some of the lab testing data. And the more data that you put into the system, the more accurate the reading and the more clear the results. So what we've looked at is now what is the patient responsibility, but a lot of the magic of TruNeura happens for the practitioner on the TruNeura Pro side. And in a minute, we're going to talk through some of the subsets of root cause that you've identified that you can look at. But I guess maybe let's just talk for a little bit about some of what's happening in diagnosing brain health conditions, and understanding what's going on, because it's an exciting time to be in the field. Yeah,
it really is. So, for a while we've had, of course, many different types of direct cognitive testing that we can do with patients, like the MoCA test, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, or the Mini Mental Status Exam, et cetera. And then we've had some computer-based testing that has been pretty accessible to practitioners. CNS vital signs, for example, is one that we use often. But what we didn't have ready access to was a way of helping to assess where the patient was on that Alzheimer's pathology progression. And that all changed in this last year when we got access to the blood biomarkers that we can now get readily at LabCorp and at Quest. The p-tau217, which is very specific to Alzheimer's disease. That is a blood test that we can utilize, and we can start to see changes in tau, the protein that ends up getting tangled in the brain. And that really, in a way, gives us a sense of the expansion of amyloid in the brain. And that test has been shown to have about a 90% correlation to amyloid PET scan results. So without having to do a radiation-based examination or having to do a spinal tap, we can get really accurate information about what's going on in the patient's brain. And when we combine that with something like the amyloid beta 42/40 ratio, where we can see the different types of amyloid, and we know that that pathological change is when that number starts to drop. And I don't know why they decided to do the ratio that direction, so that a low number is bad and a high number is better, because it's very hard, because everything else, the high number is better, but that's how it is, so we all have to deal with that. But we have those, and then we have things like neurofilament light, which is indicating just damage to the neurons. That can be abnormal even in things like head trauma or concussion. Like, that could be used to monitor like kids after, they get a head injury in a football game, for example. And then the last one is GFAP, or glial fibrillary acidic protein. And that one is telling us about activation of the glial cells. So basically the inflammatory cells within the brain. So we have a whole array of tests now that we can do from a simple blood test that can really give us a sense of where that patient is and how things are progressing.
Beautiful, I love that. And just before we get into these 6 subsets of root cause that you've identified, I want to just take a moment to talk about, the potential of what's really going to be happening here, which is that in this software, the lab markers, which could be as many as 400, right? But as many or a few as you need, can be scored individually and then combined. Those scoring combined to give practitioners really insight, and that's using a combination of advanced mathematics and artificial intelligence. And I guess I just wanted to before we go into the details, what sort of an impact you're hoping that this kind of information will make for practitioners compared to spreadsheetsville, currently.
Integrated spreadsheets. Yeah, so I think, the subsets of root cause are also not a novel concept in and of themselves. Like Dr. Bredesen has identified ways that the brain becomes damaged in Alzheimer's. This construct that we're using is a little bit different in that it's really focused on how I see that we need to address the patient's physiologic imbalances so that we can track them and improve them consistently. And so that's really what we're looking to do when we're doing the separations into the subsets.
Awesome. Well, let's just go through some of those today so that practitioners can understand the way that you think and how you think about this. So the first one is metabolic inflammation. We've all heard of type 3 diabetes. Why is this critical?
Right, so glucose dysregulation and the type 3 diabetes type that leads to some of the cognitive impairment that we see is one of the most important pillars. It's why the ketogenic diet is often used in reversing cognitive decline, because we need to change the fuel source that the brain depends on and make it ketones instead of glucose. It's interesting because the blood-brain barrier is not able to control the amount of glucose that comes into the brain. And so when the body's blood sugar is high, the brain's blood sugar is high. And so that's a really important thing. And then, of course, the whole cascade from that of different inflammatory markers that become abnormal as we have abnormal blood sugar regulation. HSCRP comes to mind, TNF-alpha, interleukin-6. These are all things that can be related to the metabolic dysfunction or can be occurring independently.
Yeah, that's really powerful. All right, well, let's jump into the second one. We've got nutrients and mitochondria. We've had a lot of content over the last couple of years on mitochondrial function. It seems like that's a sort of a mission critical moment in functional medicine for us really understanding its actual role in the body. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think all of us that work in functional medicine certainly recognize the critical importance of mitochondria and the production of ATP and energy for all of the different functions that the body needs to do. So that doesn't come as a surprise, but being able to focus in on all of the different contributing components that we can be paying attention to so that we can really be optimizing what the mitochondria can do, adding in our move component so we can increase mitochondrial number and density within the cells, like all of the things that we need to work together to improve how the individual neuron can function, how the body can function as a whole. And then nutrients really goes without saying. We all know that it's really important to have balanced nutritional status so that we have the building blocks that we need.
Awesome. And then the one that I was probably the most surprised with, and I don't know this world at all, but hormonal and trophic. Why are those important, and why did you put them together into one score?
So we need to have hormones that are balanced in order to stimulate the areas of the brain that we want to be trying to improve. And for example, by that I mean we have both men and women have multiple areas in the brain that have a fairly high density of estrogen receptors. The hippocampus happens to be one of them, but there are other areas that are commonly atrophied in Alzheimer's disease that also have a high density of estrogen receptors. So balancing those gender hormones in both sexes is really important in stimulating that part of the brain to grow and maintain its connections. And then, of course, we all know, even from our beginnings in medicine, that thyroid balance is important in brain health. And so are our adrenal hormones, like the pregnenolone as our parent hormone compound, our DHEA, all of these create that environment of health and healing.
Awesome. And then talk a little bit about cardiovascular, because this was your area of expertise before you got into this world. And how does your understanding and skill in vascular health inform the outcomes here in cognitive decline?
Yeah, you're right. It was actually one of the things that kind of led me into this work as well, because as you start focusing on vascular health as a specific entity, and you start dialing in at the deeper levels. First, we learn about endothelial dysfunction, and then, of course, learning about the endothelial glycocalyx that lines every blood vessel and is a super critical part of the blood-brain barrier. So it has control over what gets in to the brain. And so I think when you start putting those pieces together of how all of those components work in the physiology, then you really recognize that focusing on blood vessel health is one of the key things to maintaining brain health.
Amazing. All right, now we're going to get into talking about biome and biotoxins. This was obviously, what came up last year with my father. You were able to sort of predict that when a rapid cognitive decline occurs, that mold or an infection can be part of it. Tell us a little bit about this area and why this is so critical.
Yeah, so I really got started in biotoxin work when I was working more with patients with chronic fatiguing illnesses like chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia. And you start to see the effects of these toxins that are produced by the molds that we're living with if we have water damage in our home. And that creates oxidative stress, that creates inflammation. It has a direct toxic effect in different tissues, particularly in the brain.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has been interesting to observe as I've worked with patients is that sometimes the thinner patients that don't have a lot of body fat don't have a lot of fat storage area for these types of toxins, which have to be stored in a fatty tissue. So it seems that they end up with a greater cognitive toxic effect because that's their lipid reserve. That's where they have to put the toxins. So we have to look at those components plus the pesticides and the herbicides and the glyphosate, which affects us and affects our gut microbiome. All of the different components of that are going to play in to what we need to change.
Awesome. And then the last one, chemical toxins. I mean, when I was first coming into the industry, you would hear a lot of things about aluminium and there's or aluminum, say here, and that effect on Alzheimer's. But I know there are a lot of different toxic inputs, and it's how do you see this helping practitioners understand this part of the scoring?
Yeah, I think we all get trained in the detoxification arena of the foremost toxic of the heavy metals, lead and mercury, arsenic and cadmium, and addressing those, monitoring them, following them until we get them eliminated or as close to eliminated from the body as we can. We have, I mentioned the chemical toxins, just bringing or offloading the toxic burden that we get from our exposome and addressing all of those various components is really the only way that we get lasting benefit for cognitive health.
Awesome. Well, look, I want to appreciate you so much for sharing all of this here and a little bit about the TruNeura method, right, and what we're going to be bringing forth. But I guess I want to share a different piece of appreciation is that, over the years of working in functional medicine, you get to know practitioners, and some are good speakers, and some do great on podcasts otherwise. And this has been harder than I think we thought that it was going to be at the beginning. And I just want to appreciate you for your stick-to-itiveness as it relates to the spreadsheets and the weighting and all those details, because it's a lot. And I don't know any other doctor that I've spent a lot of time with that would have the combination of the knowledge, the passion, and then also the level of detail needed to pull off something like this. And I'm really glad that we've had a chance to do that. And I know this is just the beginning.
Yeah, it's been really fun working on it. And you're right, it has been a lot harder than we anticipated. But I think bringing in the scoring and the weighting so that we can help practitioners to see where that person's physiology is the most out of balance is really one of the most magical things about TruNeura.
So part of what I'm most excited about this is that I think there's so much value for everyone involved in the reversal of chronic illness. For patients knowing what they have to do and having everyday reminders from the automated intelligence and the artificial intelligence of what they should be doing every day, and it all prioritized and fed back with their wearables, is going to be a dramatic improvement in the quality of experience of going to a functional medicine practice and what happens in between the visits. For the coaches, this is going to be a dramatic change for coaches in practices because you are going to see what the patient actually did. You know, so much of functional medicine and being a functional medicine health coach is about really understanding what are people doing when you're not watching. And there is insight here that coaches will get to see whether people are sleeping the way they're recommending and so forth. And that feedback mechanism is going to be really powerful. And for doctors, it's going to be really powerful, and doctors and providers to actually use the scoring mechanism to understand what is the root cause in this particular patient's physiology, what is the score of those, and then track it over time. And I think that's going to be really powerful. And it's going to be powerful for two different types of providers. One is the new practitioner. You know, online, I see so many practitioners who are feeling stuck, that they don't know enough and they don't feel supported because yes, the education resources are incredible out there, but I still think we're lacking a level of local and ongoing mentorship to make it easy for practitioners. And what I think TruNeura really is a next generation clinical mentorship where you can be supported on your journey to understand translationally how this care should be deployed in the patient individually sitting in front of you. And then for established functional medicine practices, you know, one of the things that I've heard time and time again is how hard it is for practitioners to transfer their knowledge that they may have spent 10 years getting to the next doctor or the next practitioner that they hire. And so I think this is going to allow practitioners to expand their offerings rapidly with the support of this software. So I'm very excited for what 25 is going to bring. I think there's going to be, it's going to fit perfectly with our theme of transformation. And I'm really excited. You'll be hearing over the next few months, you'll be hearing more and more about, you know, what we're doing here at TruNeura and how it can be impactful. The next step is to download this guide. There's a QR code on the screen right now, and you can download the complete guide to reversing cognitive decline by Dr. Kristine Burke. It's going to bring in some of the things that we've spoken about today, and we'll start you on the journey. And in 2025, we'll be bringing you the TruNeura clinical mentorship, where you'll learn from Dr. Burke, you'll learn from myself as talking about how to organize and deploy a successful program or a membership using cognitive decline focus program in your practice, and also leaders from across the field who Dr. Burke works with all the time who are here to bring their expertise to it. So if you go here and you download this guide, we'll be in touch with more of the details. I'm super excited for this functional forum. It's not the usual way that we've done it, but if you look back at our history, we have been in the business of providing tools that solve really important friction points in the adoption of functional medicine. As I said at the beginning, I feel like this may be the final friction point, which is that functional medicine up until this point has been really too hard and too slow to become a standard of care. And for all those practitioners that have slogged through it to deliver incredible outcomes in your practice all day, every day, I salute you. And I hope that this may be a gift that we as a community can now reverse chronic illness at the scale that it exists, particularly starting with cognitive decline, which is everywhere and only set to get worse. So thanks so much for tuning in. If you have questions, feel free to get in touch, and look forward to the next conversation. We will be back in January with my talk from the WHO and many other surprises. We'll be back at the beginning of the year. Thanks so much for a great 2024. It has really shaken the foundation of what we thought was possible. I'm your host, James Maskell, and we'll see you next time.